Most people say they want freedom, but what they really want is comfort with support. They want peace while still leaning on someone. They want strength while being carried. Buddhism does not offer that bargain. The Buddha never promised companionship on the path. He promised clarity, and clarity is lonely. If you are suffering, it is not because life is cruel. It is because you are still leaning. Freedom does not begin when others help you. Freedom begins when you stop needing them. 1. Dependence is a form of attachment. Needing support feels harmless. It even feels natural. From childhood, we are taught to rely on parents, friends, teachers, partners, communities. We are told that needing others is strength, that independence is cold, that standing alone is dangerous. Because of this conditioning, emotional dependence hides in plain sight. It disguises itself as love, loyalty, humility, or vulnerability. But Buddhism asks you to look carefully, not sentimentally. When you depend on someone emotionally, you hand them authority over your inner state. Your peace is no longer yours, it becomes conditional. If they show up, you are calm. If they withdraw, you collapse. If they approve, you feel worthy. If they criticize or disappear, your mind spirals. This is not connection, this is instability. Your calm rises and falls with their presence. Your confidence depends on their reassurance. Your emotional ground depends on their consistency. This is not accidental, this is attachment. Attachment is not just clinging to objects, money, or pleasure. That is a shallow understanding. Attachment is any condition where your well-being depends on something outside your direct awareness and control. People are among the strongest objects of attachment because they feel alive, responsive, and personal. But that is exactly why dependence on them creates suffering. The Buddha did not limit attachment to material possessions. He pointed to craving itself, the craving to be held emotionally, to be reassured, to be stabilized by another. Reassurance feels comforting, but it trains the mind to distrust its own capacity to stand. Validation feels warm, but it teaches the mind that worth comes from outside. Emotional rescue feels relieving, but it weakens the muscle of self-observation. When you constantly need someone to talk you down, you never learn to sit with your mind. When you always seek reassurance, you never learn to trust clarity. When you lean on others to regulate your emotions, you never develop inner balance. This is why dependence is dangerous. Not because others are bad, but because the mind becomes lazy. It stops observing and starts reaching. It stops understanding and starts requesting. Over time, this reaching becomes unconscious. You don't even realize you are leaning, you just feel anxious when support is absent. As long as you need someone to stand, you are not standing. You are borrowing balance. Borrowed balance feels real in the moment, but it is temporary by nature. People get tired, people leave, people change. Even the most loving, consistent person cannot be permanently available. When the source of borrowed balance disappears, the collapse feels sudden and unfair, but it was always inevitable. This is the core insight many people avoid. Suffering does not come from loss itself. It comes from the dependence that existed before the loss. If your peace depended on someone, their absence will hurt. If your identity depended on a role, its ending will wound you. If your stability depended on reassurance, silence will feel unbearable. Buddhism does not condemn needing help in practical matters. If you are injured, you seek treatment. If you lack food, you accept nourishment. This is not the issue. The issue is psychological dependence, the belief that another person is required for your inner stability. The Buddha's path is not about isolating yourself from others. It is about removing the illusion that others can carry your inner weight. They cannot. They never could. and expecting them to do so is not love, it is confusion. True compassion begins when you stop demanding emotional regulation from others. True connection begins when you no longer cling. True peace begins when the mind learns to sit without leaning. This does not happen overnight. The mind has been trained for years to reach outward. When support is removed, discomfort arises, anxiety appears, loneliness surfaces. This is not a sign of failure. It is the nervous system realizing it has been outsourcing stability. If you stay present instead of escaping, something important happens. You begin to see the impermanent nature of emotions. You observe how fear rises, peaks, and falls without anyone fixing it. You notice that discomfort does not destroy you. You learn that the mind can stabilize itself through awareness alone. This is the beginning of freedom. Dependence says, I cannot be okay unless someone is here. Wisdom says, this feeling can be observed without resistance. One creates suffering. The other dissolves it. The Buddha's teaching is uncompromising here. Anything you cling to will eventually become a source of pain. People are no exception. The solution is not withdrawal or bitterness. The solution is clarity. When you stop leaning, you do not become cold. You become grounded. When you stop depending, you do not become isolated. You become free. Borrowed balance always collapses. Inner balance endures. 2. The path cannot be walked for you. One of the most uncomfortable truths in Buddhism is this: no one can do the inner work for you. Not a teacher, not a friend, not a partner, not even the Buddha himself. People misunderstand this and think it sounds cold or dismissive. It is neither. It is precise. The Buddha did not come to carry people across suffering. He came to point at suffering and show the way through it. The walking was always yours. This is where many people get stuck. They gather teachings, quotes, talks, books, and teachers, hoping that understanding will arrive externally. They listen, agree, feel inspired, and then wait for something to change inside. When nothing changes, they look for more guidance, more reassurance, more explanations. But insight does not accumulate the way information does. It arrives only through direct seeing. No one can meditate for you. Someone can explain meditation, but they cannot sit with your breath. They cannot observe your thoughts as they arise. They cannot notice your resistance, your restlessness, your craving, your fear. That work happens in the privacy of your own awareness. No one can face your discomfort for you. No one can let go on your behalf. This is why the path feels lonely, not because you are abandoned, but because consciousness itself is solitary. Your mind is the only place where suffering appears, and therefore it is the only place where suffering can end. People may walk beside you for a while. They may encourage you, challenge you, or inspire you. But the moment clarity arises, you are alone with it. There is no applause, no confirmation, no external marker that says, yes, this is it. This is not a flaw in the path. This is the nature of awakening. Suffering is deeply personal. Two people can experience the same event and suffer in entirely different ways. One clings, one observes, one resists, one understands. Because suffering happens internally, liberation must also happen internally. This is why seeking constant guidance can quietly become avoidance. Not because guidance is wrong, but because it can delay responsibility. As long as someone else is explaining, advising, or reassuring, the mind can postpone direct engagement with its own patterns. At some point, the questions must stop being asked outwardly and start being asked inwardly. What am I clinging to right now? What am I resisting? What sensation am I trying to escape? No one else can answer these for you because they arise moment by moment inside your own experience. The Buddha was clear about this. He did not teach dependence on himself. He repeatedly emphasized personal effort, personal observation, and personal responsibility. He warned against blind belief and encouraged direct verification through experience. This is why the path is often misunderstood as harsh. People expect spiritual life to feel comforting and supported at every step. But Buddhism is not designed to soothe the ego, it is designed to expose it. When you walk the path alone, you begin to notice how often the mind wants to be carried. It wants certainty, it wants approval. It wants to know it is doing things right. These desires are subtle forms of attachment. They pull attention outward instead of inward. Walking alone means staying with uncertainty. It means allowing doubt to arise without immediately resolving it through external reassurance. It means trusting observation over opinion. This is difficult because the mind has been trained to seek authority outside itself. From early life, we are conditioned to believe that someone else knows better, that safety comes from guidance, that mistakes are dangerous. Buddhism reverses this conditioning. Mistakes are not failures, they are data. Confusion is not an enemy, it is a signal to observe more closely. When you stop expecting someone to guide every step, something shifts. You begin to listen more carefully to your own experience. You notice patterns that no teacher could have pointed out because they are specific to you. You see how craving arises in your body. You see how fear tightens the chest. You see how stories form around sensations. This kind of seeing cannot be taught. It can only be discovered. Walking alone does not mean rejecting teachers or communities. It means understanding their proper role. They point, they remind, they clarify, but they do not walk. If you expect someone else to walk for you, frustration will follow. If you accept that the path is yours alone, responsibility replaces frustration, and responsibility is empowering, not burdensome. There is a quiet confidence that develops when you stop waiting to be guided. You stop asking, "What should I do?" and start asking, "What is happening right now?" This shift is subtle but profound. One seeks direction, the other seeks truth. The path cannot be walked for you because awakening is not a transfer. It is a recognition, and recognition happens only when the mind sees directly, without intermediaries. This is why solitude is not a punishment on the Buddhist path. It is a condition for clarity. Without someone to lean on, the mind must balance itself. Without someone to reassure you, awareness must stabilize itself. And when that happens, the path no longer feels lonely. It feels honest. You were never meant to be carried. You were meant to see. 3. Seeking support often hides avoidance. Most people believe they are seeking support because they are struggling. In reality, many are seeking support because they are avoiding something. This is uncomfortable to admit, which is why it is rarely examined. When the mind feels uneasy, its first impulse is not to observe the discomfort, but to escape it. Support becomes one of the most socially acceptable forms of escape. Talking, explaining, sharing, venting, and seeking reassurance can feel productive, but often they function as distractions from direct experience. Ask yourself honestly, when you reach out for support, what are you trying to avoid feeling in that moment? Is it fear rising in the body? Is it uncertainty about the future? Is it a sense of groundlessness when old identities no longer hold? Instead of staying with these sensations, the mind looks for relief through another person. It wants to be heard, soothed, or guided so it does not have to sit with what is present. This does not mean that speaking to others is always wrong. But Buddhism is not interested in what feels helpful on the surface. It is interested in what reduces suffering at the root. Avoidance temporarily reduces discomfort, but it strengthens the habit of running. Each time the mind escapes through support seeking, it reinforces the belief that discomfort is dangerous and cannot be faced alone. Over time, this creates fragility. The moment support is unavailable, anxiety intensifies. This is why some people feel worse when they are alone. Not because solitude is harmful, but because they have trained their minds to depend on external regulation. Silence becomes threatening because it removes the escape routes. Notice how often support is sought not for insight, but for emotional smoothing. The conversation may sound reflective, but underneath it is a subtle request. Make this feeling go away. When the feeling is numbed rather than understood, it returns later with more force. Buddhism does not ask you to suppress feelings, it asks you to stay with them. This is the difference between wisdom and avoidance. Avoidance says, I shouldn't feel this. Observation says, this is being felt. One creates resistance. The other creates clarity. When you sit alone and allow discomfort to arise without reaching outward, something important becomes visible. You see that sensations are temporary. Fear moves. Sadness shifts. Restlessness peaks and dissolves. None of these states require fixing. They require witnessing. Support seeking often interrupts this process. It cuts observation short. Just as insight is about to deepen, the mind escapes into conversation, explanation, or reassurance. Relief is felt, but understanding is lost. This is why the Buddha emphasized direct experience over conceptual discussion. Talking about suffering is not the same as understanding suffering. Explaining your patterns is not the same as seeing them arise in real time. When you stop avoiding discomfort, you begin to learn from it. You see how craving creates tension. You notice how resistance tightens the body. You recognize how stories amplify pain. These insights do not come from advice. They come from stillness. Avoidance keeps the self intact. Observation weakens it. The self survives by staying busy, justified, and comforted. It dissolves when it is observed without interference. This is why avoidance feels safer than stillness. Stillness threatens the self's illusions. If you find yourself constantly needing to talk things through, pause and ask, am I seeking clarity or am I delaying contact with my own experience? The answer may not be flattering, but it will be useful. Buddhist practice is not about feeling better quickly. It is about seeing clearly, even when clarity is uncomfortable. When you stop using support as an escape, solitude becomes less frightening. It becomes instructive. Discomfort is not a problem to solve. It is a teacher to observe. When avoidance ends, learning begins. 4. Solitude is not punishment, it is training. Most people interpret solitude as rejection. They assume that being alone means something has gone wrong. They ask, why is no one here for me? Instead of asking, what is this moment teaching me? Buddhism does not treat solitude as a flaw in life. It treats it as a condition for clarity. When you are alone, the distractions fall away. There is no one to impress, no one to perform for, no one to absorb your emotional overflow. What remains is the mind, exactly as it is. This is why solitude feels uncomfortable. It exposes what constant interaction hides. In company, attention is scattered outward. In solitude, attention turns inward, and what it finds is not always pleasant. Old fears surface, unresolved grief appears, restlessness becomes loud. The mind starts telling stories to escape the stillness. This discomfort is often misunderstood as a sign that something is wrong. In reality, it is a sign that training has begun. Training is not meant to be comfortable. It is meant to reveal weakness so that strength can develop. When the body trains, muscles ache. When the mind trains, illusions ache. Solitude removes the external supports that normally stabilize the ego, forcing the mind to learn balance from within. The Buddha did not awaken surrounded by support. He awakened alone, sitting still, facing his mind without distraction. This was not because companionship was unavailable, it was because solitude creates the conditions where insight can arise. In solitude, you cannot blame others for your state. You cannot distract yourself with conversation. You cannot outsource regulation. You must observe. This observation is the heart of Buddhist practice, watching the breath, watching sensations arise and pass, watching thoughts form and dissolve. None of this requires an audience. In fact, an audience often interferes. When solitude is approached as training rather than punishment, its meaning changes. Loneliness is no longer an enemy. It becomes information. It shows you where attachment still exists. It reveals where the mind expects something from others. Every ache of loneliness points directly to a place where clinging remains. Instead of fleeing from this ache, Buddhism asks you to sit with it, not to indulge it, and not to suppress it, but to study it. Where is it felt in the body? What thoughts accompany it? Does it stay the same, or does it change? As you observe, something unexpected happens. The ache softens, not because someone arrives, but because understanding replaces resistance. The mind realizes that it can survive this state without external rescue. This is how inner stability is built. Solitude trains you to be with yourself without needing distraction. It teaches you to tolerate uncertainty. It sharpens awareness. Over time, the mind becomes less reactive. It stops panicking when support is absent. It learns to rest in observation. People who avoid solitude remain dependent. People who train in solitude become steady. This does not mean you must isolate yourself permanently. Buddhism does not glorify withdrawal from the world. It teaches right relationship with the world. Solitude is a phase of training, not a lifelong exile. It is used to develop clarity, not to escape life. When you stop seeing solitude as abandonment, resentment dissolves. When you see it as training, gratitude can arise. You begin to understand that life did not remove support to punish you. It removed support to strengthen you. Solitude is not the absence of love. It is the absence of distraction, and in that absence, truth becomes visible. 5. Letting go is not rejection of others. Many people here let go of needing support and immediately misunderstand it. They think it means cutting people off, becoming cold, or rejecting connection. This misunderstanding creates fear and resistance, and that resistance itself becomes another form of attachment. Buddhism is not anti-relationship. It is anti-clinging. There is a critical difference between connection and dependence. Connection allows freedom. Dependence creates obligation, expectation, and silent demand. When you depend on others for emotional stability, you begin to need them to behave in specific ways. You need them to respond on time. You need them to understand you. You need them to remain consistent. When they fail, frustration and resentment arise. This is how suffering enters relationships. Letting go does not mean withdrawing love. It means withdrawing expectation. You stop asking others to regulate your inner state. You stop placing the responsibility for your peace on someone else's presence or behavior. When this happens, relationships change in a quiet but profound way. You can listen without needing to be heard back. You can give without secretly waiting to receive. You can be present without demanding reassurance. This is not indifference. It is maturity. The Buddha taught that clinging turns love into suffering. When you cling, you fear loss. When you fear loss, you control. When you control, you suffer. Letting go breaks this chain. When you no longer lean on others for emotional balance, you stop pulling on them unconsciously. They are no longer burdened with your expectations. They can be who they are, not who you need them to be. This creates lighter relationships. Instead of asking, "Are you there for me?" the mind rests in, "I am here." Instead of scanning for support, awareness remains grounded. From this ground, compassion becomes cleaner. It is no longer mixed with need. You can care without attachment, help without dependence, and love without fear of collapse. Letting go also removes resentment. Much resentment is not caused by others' actions, but by unspoken expectations. You expected support. You expected understanding. You expected consistency. When reality failed to match these expectations, suffering followed. Buddhism does not ask you to harden your heart. It asks you to soften your grip. When you let go of needing others to complete you, you stop using them as emotional tools. You meet them as fellow beings, each dealing with their own impermanence and limitations. This recognition deepens empathy instead of reducing it. There is also a freedom that appears within yourself. When you are no longer depending on others for stability, you stop fearing their absence. This allows you to enjoy presence without clinging to it. Time together becomes appreciation rather than insurance. Letting go does not mean you stop receiving help when it is offered. It means you are not psychologically dependent on it. You can accept support without collapsing when it is unavailable. You can walk alone without bitterness. This is the balance Buddhism points to. Not isolation, not fusion, but non-attachment. When you stop rejecting solitude and stop clinging to connection, relationships find their natural place. They become part of life, not the foundation of your peace. Letting go is not turning away from others. It is turning toward clarity, and clarity makes connection possible without suffering. 6. Rebuilding the self is a temporary step. This lesson is where many people get confused, because the language of rebuilding yourself sounds strong, disciplined, and empowering. It feels necessary, especially after loss, betrayal, isolation, or collapse. From the outside, rebuilding looks like progress. From a Buddhist perspective, it is more complicated. Buddhism does not deny the usefulness of rebuilding. It simply refuses to mistake it for the final destination. When your life has fallen apart, structure is needed. When the mind is chaotic, discipline is needed. When emotions are unstable, boundaries are needed. In this sense, rebuilding the self is a skillful step. You establish routines, you strengthen attention, you learn restraint, you cultivate steadiness. Without these, the mind remains scattered and reactive. But Buddhism is very clear. This rebuilding is provisional. The danger arises when rebuilding becomes an identity. When the mind says, "This is who I am now," clinging has returned in a more sophisticated form. The self has been reconstructed, not understood. And whatever is constructed can be threatened, defended, compared, and lost. The Buddha's insight was not about creating a better self. It was about seeing through the idea of a permanent self altogether. The self is a process, not an entity. It is a collection of habits, memories, reactions, and stories arising moment by moment. Rebuilding organizes this process, but it does not reveal its emptiness. This is why Buddhism treats discipline as a raft, not a home. You use it to cross chaos, not to settle into identity. Rebuilding the self without understanding impermanence leads to subtle suffering. Pride creeps in, fear of regression appears, comparison with others arises. The mind starts protecting the rebuilt version of itself. This protection creates tension. The very structure meant to stabilize becomes another source of anxiety. A rebuilt self still needs validation. It still fears collapse. It still compares. Only insight dissolves this. From a Buddhist perspective, rebuilding alone is necessary because it removes dependency. You learn that you can function without emotional crutches. You learn self-regulation. You learn restraint. These are essential foundations. But once stability is present, the work shifts. The question is no longer, how do I improve myself? It becomes, what is this self made of? Observation replaces construction. You begin to see how identity arises from thought, how moods color perception, how memory creates continuity where none actually exists. You notice that the self feels solid only when it is not examined. Under attention, it flickers. This realization is unsettling at first. The mind likes solidity. It wants something to stand on. This is why many stop at rebuilding. Dissolving the self feels like loss. In truth, it is relief. When you see that the self is not a fixed thing, suffering loosens. There is less to defend, less to prove, less to protect. Life becomes lighter, not because circumstances improve, but because the weight of identity drops. Rebuilding alone prepares you for this stage. It gives the mind enough strength to face emptiness without panic. Without discipline, insight becomes destabilizing. Without insight, discipline becomes rigid. This balance is central to Buddhism. You rebuild so you can stand. You observe so you can let go. If you cling to rebuilding as the goal, you remain trapped in effort. If you skip rebuilding and chase insight prematurely, you risk confusion. The path is gradual, precise, and honest. The mistake many make is turning rebuilding into a permanent project. They spend their lives refining a self that was never meant to be permanent. Buddhism does not ask you to perfect the self. It asks you to understand it fully. Rebuilding is not the end. It is preparation. When the time comes, even the rebuilt self must be released. Not in collapse, but in clarity. Only then does freedom become stable, because it no longer depends on who you think you are. 7. Freedom is quiet and unimpressive. Most people imagine freedom as a dramatic transformation. They expect confidence, certainty, charisma, or visible strength. They expect a version of themselves that looks powerful from the outside. Buddhism dismantles this fantasy. True freedom is not loud. It does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition. In fact, it often goes unnoticed, even by the person experiencing it. Freedom in the Buddhist sense is not the presence of something new. It is the absence of something old. It is the absence of compulsive needing, the absence of leaning, the absence of inner resistance. When these absences appear, there is no fireworks. There is simplicity. This is why freedom feels unimpressive to the ego. The ego thrives on achievement, identity, and narrative. Freedom removes the need for all three. There is nothing to show, nothing to defend, and nothing to maintain. When the mind stops leaning, it becomes still, not because life becomes calm, but because the mind is no longer fighting reality. Thoughts still arise, emotions still appear, situations still change. But there is no urgent grasping, no internal argument, no demand that things be different. This is liberation. Many people overlook this state because it does not match their expectations. They assume something is missing. They think, is this all? They look for intensity, purpose, or emotional highs. In doing so, they miss the depth of what has occurred. Freedom feels ordinary. Breathing feels ordinary. Walking feels ordinary. But the suffering that used to accompany these experiences is gone. In Buddhist practice, this is often described as peace that does not depend on conditions. Not happiness, not pleasure, not excitement, but ease. ease with change, ease with uncertainty, ease with impermanence. This ease cannot be manufactured. It arises naturally when attachment weakens. When you no longer need reassurance, silence is no longer threatening. When you no longer need validation, anonymity feels safe. When you no longer need support, solitude feels neutral. Freedom does not make you special. It makes you available. Available to experience life without filters. Available to respond rather than react. Available to meet discomfort without panic. This availability is quiet. It does not seek attention. Because freedom is unimpressive, it is also easy to abandon. The mind may return to seeking stimulation or meaning. It may try to rebuild identity. This is why mindfulness remains important even after insight. Not to achieve something new, but to avoid slipping back into old habits. Freedom does not require effort to maintain, but it requires honesty. The moment you start leaning again, tension returns. The mind knows. It always knows. There is a subtle dignity in this freedom. It does not need approval. It does not argue. It does not explain itself. It simply is. Others may not notice a change. Some may even feel confused by your lack of reactivity. This is not your concern. Buddhism does not measure success by external impact. It measures it by the reduction of suffering. When craving weakens, success has occurred, whether anyone sees it or not. This is why the Buddha did not build monuments to himself during his life. He did not create an image to uphold. He pointed away from himself, toward observation. Freedom does not make life dramatic. It makes it honest. There is no urge to impress, no urge to prove, no urge to lean. What remains is a quiet steadiness that does not need explanation. This is the freedom that begins when you stop leaning. 8. The end of leaning is the beginning of peace. At some point on this path, something very subtle happens. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just a quiet shift in how the mind relates to experience. The urge to lean weakens. You no longer scan the world for something to hold you together. You no longer look for people, words, routines, or explanations to stabilize your inner state. Not because you are stronger in an aggressive way, but because the habit of grasping has worn thin. This is not numbness. This is not withdrawal. This is peace. Peace in Buddhism is often misunderstood. People think it means constant calm or the absence of difficulty. That is not what is meant. Peace is the absence of inner resistance. It is the end of the constant internal negotiation with reality, the end of asking life to be different so you can be okay. Leaning is a form of negotiation. If this person stays, I'll be okay. If I get reassurance, I'll relax. If someone understands me, this pain will stop. When leaning ends, these conditions fall away. You stop postponing peace. This does not mean pain disappears. Sensations still arise, loss still happens, uncertainty still exists. But without leaning, these experiences pass through awareness without becoming personal crises. They are no longer interpreted as threats to the self, because the self is no longer being propped up. This is the critical shift. As long as you are leaning, peace is fragile. It depends on circumstances aligning correctly, someone responding, something working out, life behaving. When peace depends on conditions, it is temporary by definition. The Buddha pointed to a peace that does not depend on conditions, not because conditions improve, but because the mind stops clinging to them. When you are no longer leaning, conditions lose their power to destabilize you. This peace is not exciting. It does not feel like relief in the way escape feels like relief. It feels neutral, steady, almost plain. This is why many overlook it. They mistake the absence of drama for emptiness. In reality, it is the absence of unnecessary suffering. When the mind stops leaning, it stops narrating everything as a problem. It no longer asks, "What does this mean about me?" It simply experiences what is happening. A sensation arises. It is known. It changes. It passes. No identity is built around it. This is where deep rest appears. Not rest as sleep, but rest as non-struggle. The nervous system begins to settle because it is no longer on constant alert, waiting for support or threat. The body feels safer because the mind is no longer demanding guarantees. You may notice that you become quieter, less reactive, less interested in explaining yourself. This is not because you are detached from life, but because you are no longer entangled with it. Entanglement requires leaning, presence does not. People around you may not understand this change. Some may interpret it as distance. Others may feel unsettled by your lack of urgency. This is not something to correct. When you stop leaning, you stop recruiting others into your inner drama. Compassion becomes simpler at this stage. You no longer help others to feel needed. You help because suffering is present. There is no emotional transaction underneath, no hidden request for validation. This makes compassion cleaner and more sustainable. The end of leaning also brings humility. You see clearly that peace was never given by others, even when it seemed that way. Others may have coincided with moments of calm, but they were never the source. Awareness was always the source. Seeing this removes blame and gratitude alike. There is nothing to resent and nothing to cling to. This is why the Buddha emphasized understanding over comfort. Comfort can be borrowed, understanding cannot. When leaning ends, you do not become invulnerable. You become unburdened. Life still moves, but it moves through a mind that is no longer gripping. There is space now. Space between sensation and reaction. Space between thought and belief. In that space, peace naturally appears, not as an achievement, not as a state to maintain, but as the default condition when clinging is absent. This is not the end of the path in a dramatic sense. There is no finish line, but it is a clear turning point. From here, practice becomes less about fixing and more about remembering. Remembering not to lean, remembering to observe, remembering that peace does not come from support, but from non-attachment. When you stop leaning, life does not become easier, but suffering becomes optional, and that is enough. 9. When you stop leaning, life becomes direct. At this stage on the path, something fundamental changes in how life is experienced. It is not a shift that announces itself loudly or arrives with emotion. It is a change in orientation. Experience becomes direct. There is less interpretation layered on top of what is happening, and more simple knowing of what is present. Leaning creates distance between you and life. When the mind is leaning, it is always referencing something else. It measures the present against expectations, support, reassurance, or imagined outcomes. Experience is filtered through the question, "Is this enough for me to be okay?" Because of this filtering, life feels heavy, complicated, and personal. When leaning stops, this filter dissolves. Events no longer need to confirm your stability. Emotions no longer need to be explained away. Sensations no longer need to be managed. Life is experienced as it is, not as a test of whether you are supported. This directness is deeply stabilizing. It does not depend on thought. It does not require analysis. Awareness simply meets what arises and allows it to be known fully. Because there is no grasping, nothing sticks. Experiences move through without leaving residue. In Buddhist terms, this is a reduction of conceptual proliferation. The mind stops multiplying experience into stories, meanings, and identities. A sound is just a sound. A sensation is just a sensation. A thought is just a thought. None of them demand a response. This simplicity is not naive. It is refined. When you stop leaning, you stop narrating your life as a problem to be solved. Challenges still occur, but they are addressed practically rather than emotionally. Pain is recognized as pain, not as a statement about you or your future. Pleasure is enjoyed without clinging. Loss is acknowledged without collapse. Direct experience also brings honesty. Without leaning, there is nothing to hide behind. You see your reactions clearly. You notice when craving arises. You notice when aversion appears. There is no need to justify or suppress these movements. They are simply observed. This honesty is uncomfortable at first. Many people prefer mediated experience because it softens reality. Direct experience can feel stark because it removes comforting narratives. But this starkness is not cruel. It is clean. The Buddha taught that suffering is intensified by the stories we add to experience. When those stories fall away, suffering loses much of its force. What remains is sensation and awareness, not struggle. When life becomes direct, gratitude also changes. It is no longer dependent on conditions being favorable. It arises naturally from being present. Even neutral moments carry a quiet completeness because nothing is being resisted. This directness also reduces fear. Much fear is generated by anticipation and interpretation. When experience is met directly, the mind stays with what is actually happening rather than what might happen. This grounds awareness in the present moment, where most imagined threats do not exist. Relationships also shift under this condition. Without leaning, interactions are simpler. There is less projection. You meet people as they are, not as sources of support or validation. This reduces disappointment and increases clarity. You stop trying to extract something from others, and communication becomes more honest. Direct experience does not make life easier in a superficial sense. It removes unnecessary difficulty. The difference is subtle but profound. Life still includes effort, responsibility, and change, but without the added burden of constant evaluation. This is why Buddhist practice emphasizes presence over solutions. Solutions are needed for external problems. Presence addresses the root of suffering, which is misrelation to experience itself. When you stop leaning, you stop asking life to hold you. You discover that awareness is already sufficient. This discovery is not philosophical, it is experiential. It reveals itself in ordinary moments when nothing special is happening and yet nothing feels lacking. Life becomes direct because there is no intermediary. No support structure is required for experience to unfold. Awareness meets what is present, and that is enough. This is not indifference, it is intimacy with reality as it is. When leaning ends, life no longer feels like something happening to you. It feels like something happening, and you are present for it without resistance. That is directness. 10. Freedom continues through remembering, not effort. By the time the mind reaches this stage, a subtle mistake often appears. After seeing the relief that comes from not leaning, the mind tries to hold on to it. It attempts to protect freedom, maintain peace, or preserve clarity through effort. This effort, although understandable, quietly reintroduces leaning in a new form. Buddhism is precise here. Freedom does not continue through force. It continues through remembering. Remembering does not mean recalling ideas or repeating teachings. It means staying aware of the tendency to lean and not feeding it when it appears. The habit of leaning does not vanish forever in a dramatic moment. It weakens, but it can reappear in subtle ways, especially during stress, uncertainty, or emotional intensity. At this stage, the work is no longer about improvement. It is about non-forgetting. When discomfort arises, the mind may try to return to old strategies. It may seek reassurance, distraction, explanation, or control. These impulses are not failures, they are reminders. Each time the mind notices the impulse to lean and does not follow it, freedom deepens. This is why Buddhist practice emphasizes mindfulness rather than willpower. Willpower creates tension, mindfulness creates space. When awareness is present, leaning is seen as an unnecessary movement. There is no need to suppress it. Seeing is enough. Effort has a place earlier on the path. Discipline, restraint, and commitment are essential for building stability. But if effort is not released at the right time, it becomes another form of clinging. The mind starts trying to hold peace in place, which contradicts the very insight that created peace in the first place. Impermanence applies to freedom as well, not in the sense that freedom is lost, but in the sense that experience keeps changing. Peace is not a state that freezes life. It is a way of relating to change without resistance. Remembering allows flexibility. The mind remains alert without being tense. It does not panic when agitation arises. It does not celebrate when calm appears. It understands that both are movements within awareness, not definitions of success or failure. This understanding removes the pressure to stay enlightened. There is no such demand in Buddhism. There is only the invitation to remain honest. Honesty means noticing when leaning returns and gently letting it go again. This process is quiet and continuous. There are no milestones to announce, no final achievement to defend. Practice becomes woven into ordinary life. Walking, speaking, working, resting, all become opportunities to notice whether the mind is leaning or simply present. Freedom matures through this simplicity. It becomes less about special moments and more about ordinary stability. The nervous system learns that it does not need to mobilize around every change. The mind learns that it does not need guarantees. Remembering also brings humility. You see that freedom is not something you own. It is something that happens when conditions are right. This prevents pride and complacency. It keeps practice alive without making it heavy. At this stage, effort softens into attentiveness. Discipline relaxes into ease. The path no longer feels like a project. It feels like alignment with reality. Freedom continues not because you push forward, but because you stop interfering. When the mind remembers not to lean, peace is already there. Freedom was never waiting for someone to arrive. It was waiting for you to stop leaning. Throughout this path, one truth keeps revealing itself in quieter and quieter ways. Suffering does not come from being alone, unsupported, or unseen. It comes from the habit of asking the world to hold what only awareness can hold. Every time the mind leaned outward, tension followed. Every time it returned inward, steadiness appeared. You were not abandoned when support fell away. You were being returned to yourself. Buddhism does not promise a life without difficulty. It points to a way of meeting difficulty without adding unnecessary pain. When you stop leaning, experience becomes simpler. Sensations arise and pass. Emotions move without defining you. Thoughts appear without commanding belief. Life unfolds without needing permission. There is nothing dramatic at the end of this process. No final identity. No permanent state to claim. What remains is a quiet reliability of mind. A knowing that whatever arises can be met without grasping and without escape. This is not isolation. It is independence from illusion. When you no longer depend on support for peace, support becomes optional rather than essential. When you no longer seek rescue, presence becomes sufficient. When you stop leaning, you stand naturally, without effort. The path does not ask you to reject the world. It asks you to stop clinging to it. Freedom begins there.